Dr. Dave Ebert is the director of the Pacific Shark Research Center here at Moss Landing Marine Labs. He's devoted his life to studying the ocean's most elusive, dangerous, and fascinating predator, the shark. He's an author of 35 books, which is amazing to think about. 35 books, including the popular Sharks of the World, and pretty much any other book you see out there that says Sharks of the Someplace or Sharks and Rays of the Someplace. Dave's written it, and these are really the most authoritative guides in terms of the species that are there, their taxonomy, their natural history, identification guides, all that in these great books. In addition to that, he has over 700 publications. 700. I'm excited I have 50. 700, I don't know how you do that.
Keep busy.
Yeah, keep busy, which is pretty spectacular. So yeah, and a lot of the work that Dave and his lab has done has been on identifying and describing new species, taxonomy, systematics, evolutionary relationships among sharks, age and growth patterns, other aspects of their life history and demography, trophic ecology, home range and movement patterns. Basically, if you can do it with a shark or a ray, Dave has probably done it. So Dave holds numerous positions, including past president of the American Elasmobranch Society, scientific advisor to the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, research associate at the California Academy of Sciences and South African Institute for Aquatic Biodiversity, and the IUCN Shark Specialist Group. I think you're collecting your appointments, which is great. And here at Moss Landing, how many students have you advised? 30, 40 or so? 35 students he's advised at Moss Landing. Right, and you can also see him a lot on TV. So Dave's appeared on various programs for the BBC, the Discovery Channel, National Geographic, ABC's Good Morning America, NBC's Today Show, and NBC News. He's also a regular on Shark Week, and he's led expeditions in search of the rarest, most elusive sharks all over the world. He's probably gone out of the country more often than he's actually in the country. He's discovered new species even while filming on location. Dave is co-host of the popular podcast Beyond Jaws, where he shares stories from his latest explorations and interviews leaders in the field. Follow him on Instagram at Lost Shark Guy. And so Dave's going to tell us today about lost sharks.
Lost sharks. Thanks, Scott. Thanks for the introduction. I might mention that my most recent book just actually came out today. We had a launch. I was on a virtual thing with South Africa Day. It's the coastal fishes of the Western Indian Ocean. That's been like a 12-year. I don't want to say fiasco, but it's been a long haul. And the thing about it is four of my former students, Kelsey James, James Nucky, Jenny Kemper, and I'm missing somebody else. Megan Witten. We're all graduate students here back in about 2010, and they actually wrote chapters for the book, and now 3 of them have got their PhDs, and their book finally came out, so I'm really happy about that, to have the students out there. So anyway, thanks for coming this afternoon. Today, I'm going to start by sharing with you a story. Benchley, and how his best-selling book, Jaws, and the blockbuster movie that resulted from that unexpectedly transformed the field of shark research. But my story today is also about one of exploration. It's about pursuing one's passion and about taking the road less traveled. So now imagine what it was like to be an explorer just 30, 40 years ago, before social distancing was popular. I was living in South Africa working on my PhD. I'd load up my truck and head off to a country called Namibia, to a remote area of the world known as the Skeleton Coast. I told my advisor, Leonard Campagno, I'd be gone 8 weeks, and a few other friends. I'd be gone 8 weeks. If you didn't hear from me from 10 weeks, you might send someone to go look for me. And away I would go. And really all I had that time was a map and a compass. Because at that time, there was no cell phone, there was no GPS, no computers, no internet. It was just, literally, it was off to explore a remote part of the world. Now the thing about being an explorer is it could be a metaphor for life. It's about the road taken. The question is, do you want to follow the path in life of an explorer or a settler? Because the first thing you need to know if you're going to be an explorer is you don't follow the herd or swim with the school. It's not what's going to set you apart. Now, to choose a path and explore, you need to think outside the box. So with that in mind, we're going to talk about the shark everyone's familiar with, and that's the great white shark. Now, today we see this is one of the best studied sharks in the world. in that, you know, you flip on a TV, you see white sharks breaching. There's a lot of conservation policy have been in place, and they're one of the most protected as well as one of the more studied. But 40 years ago, we didn't know anything about the white shark when we first started. In fact, the first age and growth study was done here at Moss Landing Marine Laboratories by Greg Kaye and myself and two of his other students, Lisa Natanson and Bruce Weldon. And to say, when I lived in South Africa, it was kind of known that white sharks would breach. You know, again, I'm sure most of you have seen them on TV. But the thing was is that it wasn't well known to the outside world. And of course, you know, at the time, like, you could go out and see that behavior. But, you know, I was a student, and I never thought, like, hey, maybe I ought to photograph these things and maybe make some money off of it. Well, a friend of mine, a few years later, Chris Fallows, he's the guy who's actually gone on and become world-renowned in terms of taking spectacular images of white sharks breaching. He got on the idea, like, hey, let me go out and film this stuff. And then, to say, he subsequently became very, very well-known and very popular about it. Now, also, South Africa at the time was the first country in the world to develop a policy for protecting the great white shark. And that was actually a situation where the fishing industry came together with the fishery agencies, because at the time there was a small group of people out there fishing white sharks, and they were catching them literally just for the jaws, because the jaws brought a lot of high value. So what they did is the industry and the fisheries agency got together to put a ban on it. It was the first time this had ever happened. Now, at the time, I was a grad student at the time. They needed to get scientific input in it. And I was very fortunate in that my advisor, Leonard Campagno, and I were the shark experts hired to retained to, like, develop the scientific basis for the policy they put together. So it was a really dynamic time. Again, for white sharks, again, nowadays you think they're fairly well protected, but that time was so revolutionary, because no one, here you got this big shark that occasionally attacks people. You're developing a policy not to target them or take them in a fishery. And after we did this back in 1990 and 1991, Australia followed in 1993 to implement a similar policy, and California did this in 1994. But policies that really helped the white shark was really done back in the 1970s, and it was the Marine Mammal Protection Act, which, by protecting some of their main food item, the adults, it allowed the populations to rebuild. And today the white sharks are one of the again, not just their populations have flourished, they've done extremely well. We have, in fact, off California now, we have some of the largest white shark populations we know. And I can go up, I've been going up occasionally with helicopters to look at surveys here, and if you go out to the cement boat, I could fly along about a mile on each side of the cement boat, and I'll count 30, 40 white sharks. I'll get tired of counting them. There's so many of them out there. And when I talk about seeing them, these are like just really in back of the surf line out there on a good day. And it's funny, in a summer day, you'll see, like, you know, people on the beach, your kids are playing in the surf, and about 100 feet in back of the kids is these white sharks just cruising along. And most of them are young of the year. They're about 6 to 8 feet long. You see some bigger ones. I don't know if any surfers here, but Manresa Beach, that's where you tend to see the larger white sharks if you're a surfer at all. So it's interesting how they do segregate around the bay here. Now, a lot of people focus on white sharks. The sharks that I'm more interested in are what I've coined the lost sharks. And these are the sharks that no one really pays much attention to. You know, I just talked a little bit about South Africa and the white sharks. Well, the thing there in South Africa is one of the 2 or 3 most diverse shark populations in the world, but you would never notice it because 99% of the people in South Africa study white sharks. But these other sharks here, you have things like the whale shark, which gets, you know, 60 feet, 15 plus meters in length, gets actually up to about 20 meters. That shark's a little better known because it's so large. It's the largest fish in the world. It has a pretty checkerboard pattern. In some areas of the world, there's actually an ecotourism trade for these white sharks. But what people don't often think are some of these things like the spined pygmy shark here. Now, this shark doesn't get much bigger than the palm of my hand, but it's a shark. In fact, most sharks, about over 80% of all shark species, don't get more than about 5 or 6 feet in length. And in fact, 50% of all shark species don't get much larger than about 3 feet long. And so a lot of the sharks have very specialized adaptations. Like, for example, you have the cookie cutter shark here. They have sort of these large suctoral lips, and they're essentially like a parasite. They take little scoop bites out of other fish, tunas, billfish, other sharks, other types of marine mammals, and they've even open ocean swimmers, like some swimming between the Hawaiian Islands, have actually been taking bites out of them. Well, the interesting thing with the cookie cutter shark is that it has the largest teeth relative to its body size of any known shark. And that includes the white shark. Now, a white shark has very large teeth, but relative to its body size, it's not that large. When people tend to think of sharks, they tend to think of things like, they tend to think sharks tend to be brown or gray or black. They never think of a shark as being pink with blue fins, like with this goblin shark here. If you ever happen to, or fortunate enough to see one in the wild or come up from a deep sea longline set or something, they tend to be pink and they have bluish fins. You also have a lot of these little cat sharks around the world, which is one of the largest groups of sharks, in that you have things like the striped pajama shark here. You have these little variegated shy sharks. Another species, you have things that are called like Pinocchio cat sharks, which have a really long nose. You have lollipop cat sharks, which are shaped like a lollipop. And by the way, on this pajama shark, if any of you saw my octopus teacher, this was kind of really the star of the show. And just so you know, the spoiler alert that these things do like to eat octopus. And when I lived in South Africa, I actually did a lot of diving, studying these things out in the same location where they filmed that show. Now, you also have species like this tail-light dogfish here, which actually secretes a bioluminescence from some glands located near the cloaca. Now, this is a shark that was first discovered off South Africa in 1966, and it's only known from 4 specimens that have ever been caught. It seems to be a deep-sea, a mesopelagic to deep-sea species, but it has this fascinating adaptation where it puts off a bioluminescence that we know nothing about, other than it must work as some kind of attractant in the deep sea. You have other species like this 6-gill saw shark. Now, most sharks have 5 gill slits on either side. There's a couple species that have 6, and there's 2 species that have 7. Now, if you're over at the Monterey Bay Aquarium, you'll see the broad-nosed 7-gill shark, which is very common there, and some of you might be aware of the blunt-nosed 6-gill, which is another one that occurs out here in Monterey Bay. But there's another one, it's called the 6-gill saw shark, that is actually, it's a difference from a sawfish because this has the gills on the sides of its head, and it does have a rostrum, but it has the gills on the side, whereas a ray has the gills ventrally. Now, so it's actually technically a sawfish versus a saw shark. But really what a ray is, and why I like to show this one, is because a sawfish is really just a flat shark. And when I talk about rays, and I'm going to show here a guitar fish, rays are really just a flattened shark. And if you put the gills underneath its ventrally, that's really all the shark is. What unites them is they're cartilaginous fish, and compared to the bony fishes. And the thing with the rays is the rays are actually more diverse than the sharks globally. There's nearly 700 species of rays compared to about 550 species of sharks. Also, in this group is what are called ghost sharks, or chimeras, or ratfish. Now, these ghost sharks, they're a smaller group. They have a long lineage going back 400 million years to where they all have a common ancestor with the sharks and the rays, which are more recent groups. But the interesting thing of these things is a lot of them are deep sea, but some of them do live along some more shallow coastal areas. A cool thing with these things is in this entire order, there's 52 known species. But what's interesting is 12 of those 52 species were discovered, named by myself and students here at Moss Landing Marine Labs. So about 25% of all the known species in this group were discovered by my lab here. In fact, one of my former students, Dr. Jenny Kemper, after she finished her master's degree, went on and did her PhD in these, and has now become quite a world expert on these ghost sharks. In fact, her and I are working on a book on the ghost sharks of the world, which would be something that hasn't been done in over 100 years, and we're going to hopefully get that out next year. So a common question I frequently get is, like, well, how many sharks are there? And when I say sharks, again, I'm referring to the rays and the ghost sharks as well. And another reason I just want to bring up why I use the term flat shark and ghost shark is because if I say ratfish or ray, most general audiences just sort of look at me like, okay, yeah, big deal, what's that? But if I use the term flat shark and ghost shark, I get a lot more attention to them. And these things, as I will explain, have a lot of concern from a conservation standpoint. So, so it's a little bit of marketing, but it gets people's attention. They pay more attention, and it'll put more energy towards trying to protect these things. But when people ask me, like, well, how many sharks are, and I tell them there's over 1,260 species of sharks, many people are just amazed by that, because they think if I just ask an audience, like, well, how many do you think there are, they might say 20, maybe 50 or 100. They have no idea there's over 1,260 species. Another question I get is like, well, that's great, Dave, but like, how, have we discovered all the sharks out there? And the answer is no. And if you look here at this chart here, between 1758 and 1899, we described on average about 3 new species of sharks a year. Between 1900 and 1979, the average was about 5 per year. Well, in the last 40 years, we're averaging over 11 new species of sharks have been described per year. And actually, over the last 15 years, we've been averaging more about 16 new species a year. And kind of a cool thing for me is that of the 25% or so of new shark species that have been described in recent years, Moss Landing is is the second leading institution in terms of discovering and naming new species of sharks, just behind a group, the CSIRO in Australia, which is the leading group internationally. So it's kind of a neat thing for me to have that the students out there really have been able to do a lot in terms of like discovering and naming these new sharks. But the question comes up is like, well, okay, so like, okay, that's kind of cool. You go out and you name, you describe new sharks, but why should we care about that? Well, you should care about it because you have if you think in terms of like terrestrial animals, lions, gorillas, elephants, or well, polar bear is technically a marine predator. Most people never see these in the wild. But there's whole conservation organizations that have been started just to protect these animals in their habitats and where they live. And so because people think about these things, you know, they're concerned about it. But when you get into the marine environment and you're dealing with things that occur that people can't see, like these lost sharks, these things, in fact, might be disappearing more rapidly than these terrestrial things I showed. For example, you have this missing honeycomb cat shark. This was a species that we used to know was common in the 1950s and 60s. We haven't seen this thing since 1972. Now, you know, and this again, despite a lot of surveys out here. So this thing was not named until 2006, 34 years after it disappeared. You have something like this Pondicherry shark, which was named in 1839. We haven't seen this shark since the 70s. And for all we know, this shark might actually be extinct. And so this is the kind of thing people, you know, I try to encourage people to think about because, you know, why everyone thinks about a white shark or some of these high trophic level sharks, a tiger shark or a bull shark, these lost sharks, as I call them, maybe are more indicative of what's going on in the environment. These are essentially really the canaries in the coal mine. It might be a precursor to what's going on in the marine environment. I've gone to places like in Taiwan and other countries. One particular village, Dashi, I've been going to since I was a graduate student back in 1988. And over the past 34, 35 years, I've documented changes talking with the fishermen and what they're catching. Whereas they used to fish from, say, 1 to 200 meters, and I could see certain things quite commonly. Nowadays, they fish down to 1,000 meters or deeper, and things that were once common you never see there. And this has just been by looking at what's going on. I talk to the fishermen, and so I get a sense of what's going on. And the same one particular fish market, I found about 10 new species at, just in the time I've gone there. And I still find occasionally new things or new records there. But that's just one example of what's going on globally in a lot of these countries and a lot of these out-of-the-way places where the fishers will tell you that they're having to fish differently, they're fishing deeper because these things are quickly disappearing. So another question I frequently get is like, well, great, where do you find these lost sharks? And that's a great question. Well, there's a few places. One, you can see them dancing on stage with Katy Perry at the Super Bowl. Sometimes they'll show up in the mail. I've literally been working on a new species of shark with someone, and when you're working on a new species, you have to borrow specimens to get them for comparative purposes. And we've requested specimens to come in from different museums like the California Academy of Sciences or the U.S. National Museum. And I've had a shark show up there for comparison, thinking I knew what it was, and it turns out it's an entirely new species of shark. So it's pretty nice. It's kind of nice if something just shows up like that in a surprise, but you just never know where you're going to find them. They've found new species of sharks in the stomachs of sperm whales. Back the day when they used to have whaling going on, there was a new species of shark discovered in the stomach of a sperm whale. There was an ichthyologist out walking on a beach in Durban back in the 1920s, found this little shark washed up on a beach. Turned out it was not only a new species of shark, it was an entirely new genus of shark. It was just a shark, the guy just recognized it, couldn't figure out what it was, and it turned out it was an entirely new genus. I've actually been doing TV shows, and we've discovered new species of sharks. This was a little lantern shark that Vicky Vasquez and I found when we were filming a Shark Week show. And the funny thing is, like, we're all excited about this new shark, and the camera guys are going, hey, we got these goblin sharks over here, we need to tag. And I said, yeah, we know what these goblin sharks are, but this is an entirely new species of shark. It just kind of shows where their mindset is, because they didn't really care at all about the new species. They're more, when they're on doing a shoot like that, they're just there to focus and get what they're looking for, which is the goblin shark. And yet, here's an entirely new thing we just randomly caught. We had no idea we were going to get something like this. The other thing is, it's often fun to go out in the boat and spend that, be out in the ocean trying to catch stuff, which is really cool, and I've certainly done plenty of that. But really the best place to find new species of sharks are at fish markets and at landing sites. And that's why I spent a lot of my time traveling around the world, in Africa and Asia, and going to out-of-the-way places and towns and villages I can't even pronounce, in Sri Lanka, in Zanzibar, in Taiwan, different places around the globe, in South America. What I go there for is I'm working with collaborators with NGOs or fisheries agencies people, and I'm trying to work with them to help them better improve their identification, because many of these countries have put together, or they're putting together, national plans of action for sharks, which is something that the FAO, the United Nations, had done back in the late 90s. They developed an international plan of action for sharks as a guideline for countries to develop their own national plans to help develop management and conservation policies for sharks and rays. So that's where a lot of times I find these new species. Going out work. I never go look for new sharks. I go work to help people improve their identification and run training workshops in a lot of these places. And during the course of that, I'll come across new species of sharks. So I get that. So a question I frequently get is like, well, gosh, Dave, that's pretty kind of cool. Like, that you get to travel around and study all these sharks. Like, how can I get a job and actually do this? And I'm kind of like, that's a great question. When it started when I was about 5 years old, and my parents gave me a book on sharks. And I thought these were like the coolest things I'd ever seen. Now, most of us, when you're little kids, sharks, whales, dinosaurs are really kind of cool, and every little kid gets kind of excited about them and stuff. But with me, I just thought these were so cool that I was just fascinated by them. Well, at the age of 10, I thought, I want to travel the world and study sharks. My parents were like, okay, yeah, he'll grow out of it. He's only 10 years old. He'll get out of this thing. But I didn't, because I knew what the end game was, where I wanted to go, and what I wanted to do, and that was to travel and to study sharks. But it was a journey I had to take to get there that was like going off to Namibia without even having a compass or a map. And this is where having a bit of an adventurous spirit, having an explorer's mindset comes into play, because it's about stepping off into the unknown without knowing what comes next. And because if you know what comes next, it's not really an adventure. But I had one small problem when I had this great idea at 10. There was no field of shark research. Because before World War II, just to give you a quick little history of this, the shark research didn't exist. It was basically people would go to different countries, different areas, or like out here in Monterey, and do a survey on the fauna out here. And they would catch fish, birds, whatever, and some sharks, and they would just report them as documented as occurring there. And sometimes they'd find something that was new, and maybe write it up as a description, or do some anatomical studies. Well, then during World War II, what happened was there was these incidents of sailors and soldiers and airmen that found themselves, after surviving a horrific event of being in combat, would find themselves in the ocean. And there were instances of people being attacked by sharks. One of the most prominent stories was the USS Indianapolis, which, after delivering the atomic bomb to the Philippine Islands, Leyte, it was torpedoed and sank, and about 900 people went into the water. And by the time, because it was on such a secret mission, by the time they were found, there was only about 300 of the sailors had survived. A lot of them died from exposure and dehydration, but some were attacked by sharks. But these stories came back into the general public, and people were didn't really want to, had this whole issue about surviving at sea and being attacked by sharks. In fact, in the movie Jaws, there's a classic scene where Quint and Hooper and the sheriff were all sitting around kind of drunk, talking about different shark stories, and Quint, the captain, talks about having survived the Indianapolis. So after World War II, for literally the next 30, 40 years, the Office of Naval Research put most of its research into developing shark repellents, and it was kind of mixed results. None of it really seemed to work at the end, but that was really all that was the extent of shark research. Well, then enter Peter Benchley with the book Jaws that came out in 1974, and then the big blockbuster movie in 1975. Now, I was in high school at the time, and so and again, up until this point, there was no field of shark research, but his book and that movie got people talking and thinking about sharks, and they started thinking well, God, how old do sharks get? How many species of sharks out there? Now, there was a lot of negative that came out of it, because every time there was a shark attack, it'd become like an event. And I grew up here in Monterey, so there'd been a few shark attacks when I was younger, and there'd be like a one-day thing in the paper, oh, somebody was attacked down by Big Sur, and that'd be it. But after Jaws, it did become more of an event when these different shark attacks would happen. But also what happened is a lot of what brought things out of the shadows where people were having these shark events, or shark derbies, people were catching sharks for fins or squalene or meat, but now people started paying more attention to it. And so I was really fortunate in the timing, because by the time I went to Humboldt State for my undergraduate and then eventually came here, I was kind of that first generation of young shark researchers, sort of the Jaws generation that really got going that started studying, really got the whole modern era of shark research going. And other people, they were kind of in my generation, if you know Chris Lowe at Long Beach State, you might see his white shark stuff, he's on the same group. In fact, Chris grew up in Martha's Vineyards, and the two boys that played the sheriff's sons in the movie were actually friends of his. They went to school together at the time. So there's a lot of little things that come up there. In fact, my advisor, Leonard Campagna, who I'll talk about more in a minute, Leonard actually was the consultant on the movie Jaws, and he designed the mechanical shark Bruce in the movie. And I watch it now, it looks kind of funky and stuff, but I can tell you, when I was in high school and I saw that movie the first time, that white shark looked pretty damn real. So, as I said, it's kind of, as I was going along this whole path trying to figure out what to do about sharks, because I knew what I wanted to do, but there was I was lucky that this whole field of shark research started to take aim. Now, it's interesting how sometimes, on your journey, you'll meet people, sometimes have a cup of coffee with, and sometimes people become like friends for life. But each has a very significant influence on your journey. And for me, when I was going to Humboldt State, I was coming up on my last quarter there, and I ran into a professor I knew there, Dr. John DiMartini. He was a director at the Talonica Marine Lab at the time, and I started talking to him one day, and he asked what I was doing. I said, I'm going to graduate next quarter, and I'm going to go off and study sharks. So that's really kind of cute, Dave. Let's go have a cup of coffee. And so we went down and had a cup of coffee at a little shop there, and I told him a little more about what my plans were, and he said, what you really need to do, Dave, if you want to go to pursue this whole shark thing, you really need to get a master's degree. And I'm thinking, a master's degree? Jesus, I'm happy to be getting a bachelor's degree, because I was an AP student, which back in my day, AP meant academic probation. So I was just lucky to be getting through school. And love talking about it, because now it's a very different thing. And then no one in my family had ever been to grad school. In fact, my dad's the only one that had gone to a 4-year college. So it was all this just getting into college was a huge deal. But it was very enlightening for me. So I went and did some research, and there wasn't any internet. You just had to kind of go to different career labs there, offices there at Humboldt State, and look around. And fortunately, I found out that here at Moss Landing Marine Labs, Greg Kaye was just really getting a shark research program going around, and this was in the early 80s. So I thought, this is great. It's not just right by where I grew up, because I actually grew up here in Prunedale, and if you ever drive by that little school there in Castroville, that's where I went to elementary and junior high school. So I could, my childhood was chasing cows around the cow pastures out here. So I made an appointment. I came over here to see Greg, and I thought the interview went pretty good, and we got to talk. I told him what I wanted to do, and as I was getting up to leave, I kind of said, Greg, what do you think the chances of me getting in here are? Because I didn't have great grades. They were okay. I wasn't, but they weren't great. And Greg looks at me and he goes, "Oh, Dave, getting in is not going to be your problem. Your problem is going to be getting out of here." At the time, and to give you, I don't know what the percents are today, but back at that time, only about 20 to 25% of the students that started here actually finished their master's degree. I don't know what the percent is nowadays. It's much higher, I'm sure. But you think about it, when you started here, your cohort, only 1 out of 5 of you were going to actually finish. And that's how competitive it used to be here at the lab. And so, I thought, okay, well, the thing was, Greg gave me a chance. And that's really all you can ask for in life, is getting a chance. Because if I blew it, then it was on me. It wasn't Greg, it wasn't anybody else, it was on me to do. So I got in here, and I thought, this is great. I'm in here, went into Greg's office after I got accepted. I said, great, what should I do for a master's thesis? And he goes, I don't know, it's your thesis, you go figure it out. So I was like, okay, well, let me figure out what I'm going to go do. So I did some more research, did some homework, and I found a guy up at named John McCosker, who was also a well-known shark expert. So one nice thing around here is you got all kinds of marine resources, just literally experts in all types of different topics and areas in this area, which is very fortunate. So I went up there to talk to John to get some idea what to do, and John tells me, he says, Dave, there's these big sharks out here, 7-gill sharks, that we catch them all the time. We have them on exhibit here at the aquarium, but we don't know anything about them. And I was like, great, I'll study these. So I got in my car and I come driving back down here to Moss Landing. I was so super excited, like, I know what I'm going to do now for a thesis. I went into Greg's office and I said, Greg, I'm going to work on 7-gill sharks. And Greg looks at me and he goes, oh, you mean Notorhynchus? And I go like, I don't know, what's that? And he's like, get out of my office and don't ever come into my office and tell me you're going to work on a thesis when you don't even know the scientific name, because you're clearly not prepared and you're going to waste my time and your time, and neither of us has time to waste. And so it was a little bit deflating at the moment, but Greg was right, and it was a valuable life lesson I learned. And so I went away, and at that time there wasn't much to look on, but I spent a week or two, got up to speed, learned what the scientific name was and everything, and then went back and had a terrific talk with Greg. So, and kind of from there, I was able to go on and really get into my thesis. Well, along the way, I met another guy who was based up at the Tiburon Marine Lab at the time, and that was Leonard Campagno, who I've mentioned a few times here. And Leonard he'd done his PhD at Stanford University, and Leonard was really one of the top guys in the world in sharks at the time. Certainly came to taxonomy and systematics. He was the guy. His pioneering work that he did back in the 60s and 70s is still cited today is really the standard. Well, I got to know Leonard, and we got to be friends, and I would stop in his office all the time. And he's, when you're on this journey like I was on, sometimes you meet a lot of people, like I've mentioned some examples, but once in a while you meet someone who's a fellow traveler, who's on that same path that I was on where I wanted to go in my career. Only in this case, Leonard was that fellow traveler, but he was already obviously very further down the road. And so he was like a mentor that I was able to learn a lot from, and we became good friends. Well, as I was finishing up my master's thesis, Leonard took a job in South Africa at what used to be the J.L.B. Smith Institute of Ichthyology. It's now the South African Institute for Aquatic Biodiversity. And so I went up there to say goodbye to Leonard and talk with him a little bit, and as I was leaving and he was getting ready to head off, I said, well, hey, Leonard, if you need anybody to carry your bags, let me know. Thinking like it's a throwaway sentence. Nobody's going to say, I'll never hear from him again. Well, you know what? About 8 months later, he called me up, and he says, hey, Dave, I have a PhD position here in South Africa. Do you want it? And there it was. It took me 17 years from the time I was 10, but here I was going to get to travel around the world, go to South Africa, and study sharks. And it was one of the best decisions and things I ever did, which led me to eventually going off to Namibia. And from that, just that kind of almost throwaway comment I made to Leonard, it's now taken me all over the world, over 35 countries, 6 continents, and I've had just some incredible experiences. But what's been a real thing is some of the people and experiences I've had along the way. For example, when I was just before I went to South Africa, they had the National Science Foundation had a funding announcement for 12 shark researchers from the United States to go to Tokyo, Japan for a major international conference. Now, this wasn't a student thing. This was an anybody can apply thing. So that meant I would be competing against Greg Kaye, Leonard Campagno, Jack Musick, Sonny Gruber, Don Nelson. I mean, it was like a name anybody you can think of at that era. And I thought, well, what the heck? You can't hit a home run if you don't go to bat. So I put in my application, and you know what? I ended up being one of the 12 people they picked. In fact, Greg was another one. We're the only 2 people from the same institution. There's only 12 of these that were selected. And I was the only person that didn't have a PhD that got selected. And that turned out to be one of the best things I ever had, because because the Emperor of Japan, if you didn't know, the former Emperor Akihito, he was quite an expert ichthyologist in gobies. And we got to have dinner at the Royal Palace there in Tokyo, which was kind of a cool thing to see. And he hosted the whole conference. It was just one of those things in life you just think like, God, this is really kind of cool to see. Now the other fellow you see up there is Nelson Mandela. Now I mentioned I'd been in South Africa. And part of the time I was based right there at the South African Museum. And from my office door, I would look right on Parliament there. And on February 11th, 1990, the day Nelson Mandela got out of prison, came down and spoke at the Grand Parade, I was fortunate enough that I was there in the crowd. For many of you, it's probably just a history thing you might have seen, but I was actually fortunate enough to have been there that day because this journey I was on, just to go look for sharks, had taken me to some incredible places. I'd go to the grocery store there at lunchtime just to pick up some snacks, and I would be standing there grabbing something, and have Bishop Desmond Tutu be standing next to me. We'd kind of just chat and make small talk, go check out through the line stuff. And so a lot of the people those times, it was an amazing experience to have. And again, this all came about from like my journey to look for sharks. And of course, along the way, I've had an opportunity. I've published quite a few books on different sharks and on the sharks and rays, including the sharks of the world. And as Scott mentioned in the introduction, I've gone over now from over 700 publications. But my journey's taken me some places I never thought I would go. And like I just wanted to do research and study sharks. And because I created this niche studying sharks, I ended up I'm like the go-to guy when a lot of these places like the BBC or Shark Week or Nat Geo wants to do something other than white shark programs. I'm like their go-to person. And it's kind of interesting. I've done a lot of stuff for the BBC. A lot of it's consulting. It's not even really in front of the camera stuff. But I was recently, actually before the lockdown, I was in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, doing some surveying there, and I post on my Instagram and stuff. And so I'm literally getting on the plane, handing the person there my ticket to scan and stuff, and I get a phone call. And I go, looks like the BBC. And I answer the phone. Yeah, it's from the BBC. It was David Attenborough's research assistant calling me. They've been following me on Instagram, and they wanted to talk to me about doing a show on the Western Indian Ocean sharks. Go figure. And so that's kind of the cool things that I never would have planned on and stuff. I mean, it's kind of because I'd worked on a number of other projects for them, so I was kind of like got to be one of their people to go to. And fortunately, this was just before the pandemic started, so I don't know if they're going to call me back at some point in time. But it was kind of cool, they're checking in. Of course, I'm talking to them as I'm walking on the plane, like, hey, can you call me back tomorrow? I'm just about to head to Mozambique right now. And they're like, okay, that's cool. So, and also in the last couple of years, I started things I just never thought I would do. But I started this podcast with a guy named Andrew Lewin, who's a podcaster out of Canada, has a program called Speak Up for Blue. And as Scott mentioned in the introduction, we have people on talking about how their journeys were to becoming shark researchers. And a lot of people I've had on there, I've had people like Chris Lowe on there, Greg Scommel. I've had several Moss Landing former people on there and current students. I had Lisa Natanson, who's a cohort of mine, Rachel Aitchison, who some of you may know, she's been on the show recently, Jenny Bigman, who just won a Eugenia Clark Award, Early Career Award, who's a former student here. She has been on there. And it's kind of cool. I get to talk to a lot of people about just their different journeys and what they do. And again, this is all stuff I never planned to do. Now, the best part of the whole thing is I've kind of come now to where I've had my own lab for the past 20 years or so, and I've had a whole basically training the next generation of students. And like, my God, Justin, I see you got your hair more trimmed from there. Yeah, I know. But I've had a chance to work with my own students here, and it's kind of cool. A couple of them there, you see Vicky Vasquez and Paul Clerkin have gone on. They've done some Shark Week shows, and many of them have gone on to other careers now, which is really cool. And so it's kind of neat being able to work with and a lot of these young people and train them in the future. One of the things we did back in 2015, on the year of the 40th anniversary of JAWS, is that we named a shark after Peter Benchley. This was something that Vicky Vasquez worked on for her master's thesis and dug along with a colleague of ours at the California Academy of Sciences. And you see it went from the big jaw sharks to a lost shark, a lantern shark here. And And so it was just kind of an honorary thing. And the cool thing is Vicki had some cousins and young people that were between the ages of 8 and 14 that she got involved in this. And they actually came up with the name, the common name for the shark, which is a ninja lantern shark, because it's kind of dark and stealthy. And it lives in the deep ocean. But Peter Benchley, though, he continued to write and he continued to get involved in a lot of conservation stuff. But he came later in his later years to feel guilty that somehow his books and his movie Jaws was a negative impact on sharks in general. But that really couldn't be further from the truth, because a lot of the stuff I mentioned earlier, the finning, the squalene, harvest oils, the meat and stuff, these were already going on for decades. But what his book did is it brought it out to the light. Unfortunately, he passed away in 2006 from cancer. I never had an opportunity to meet him, to get to know him. But it was his movie, that movie Jaws, and then that came from his book, that really gave birth this entire field of shark research. And I really wish I could convey that to him, that he really knew that. Now for me, continuing on here, as I mentioned, I work around the world, and I like working with a lot of the young people. Some people I've known, a couple of guys in your lower right-hand corner there. I've known those guys from Taiwan. I've known those guys since the 1980s. The guy on the far side there, Professor Zhuang, he was the guy that discovered whale sharks have up to 300 young. And he's become quite a prominent researcher in Taiwan. He's one of the top shark researchers. The guy between him, Captain Chen, known him. We're all about the same age, and I've known him, and he tells me a lot of stuff, the changes that have gone on in these different fishing villages there in Taiwan. But a lot of the young people, like Hamish up there from Zanzibar, he's a master's student. I spent a lot of time walking around the markets there, looking at some of the different fishes they were catching. The guys up here, the Tanzanian Fisheries Agency, working with some of those guys, some of the young men up there, and there's women there too. There are some women there. There weren't any in this particular picture. In fact, about half his staff is women. But having a chance to work with some of these people, I work with young Samunga here and a couple of his guys in South Africa. So it's been really rewarding to me to be able to work with a lot of these different young people. But one young man I met in Zanzibar, I wanted to share a little story with. This is young Abdullah. Now he's from Zanzibar, and he was with the Wildlife Conservation Society. And when I go to a lot of these countries, I work with the local NGOs, the fisheries agencies, and he was a really enthusiastic guy that I worked with there. And we would go around to the fish markets every day and record, and a document was there, and him and I ran an identification workshop. And because I don't speak Swahili, he was able to translate to all the people there, because a lot of the guys don't speak English, they only speak Swahili. Well, one day, while I was there, this guy was there every morning, 10 o'clock sharp. He was usually there a few minutes early to go off to the markets. But one day I was waiting for him down in front of the hotel there, and he was about 10 or 15 minutes late. No big deal, we got plenty of time. But he comes walking up to me, and he's really look like he's been running half the time, and and he's very apologetic for why for being late. And I said, that's no big deal. You're 10 or 15 minutes. Don't worry about it. And he says, well, and then he tells me he lost his phone. And I was like, oh man, the phones are very important to these guys in this part of the world. So I said, well, do you want to go look for it? He says, well, actually my phone got stolen. And I said, oh, well, do you want to go should we go report to the police? And as I'm talking to him, I see he's got this big lump under his shirt that was a bandage. And I said, what happened to you? He goes, oh, when I got robbed last night, I got stabbed with a panga. Now, panga's a machete. And just to give you a sense, we finished up at the day. He went this way, I went this way. He got stabbed and robbed. I got back to my hotel. That's some of the things you run into sometimes. But this guy literally, if it had been just another millimeter or two towards his neck, it would have cut his carotid and he would have bled out. He spent the night in the hospital. He left there, didn't even check out. He left there. He walked 6 kilometers in about 110-degree heat, because Zanzibar is 3 degrees off the equator. But he did not want to miss even a single day of going to the markets with me. And of course, I'm like, dude, I put him in a cab, sent him home, come back in a couple days, we'll do some more markets. You showed me enough, I can go to the markets myself today and everything. And the thing is, a guy like this, in these places like Zanzibar and Tanzania, these are poor countries. They don't have a lot of opportunity to meet and interact with people like myself unless I actually go there, and a lot of people don't. But he was just so eager that he didn't want to miss a single day. And I'm like, and why is he that eager to like nearly die to not miss a day? And it's because of things like this. This is a lost shark, Carcharodontis obscularis. This shark was named in 2019, 85 years after it went extinct. Upon this thing being named, it was declared extinct. And because this thing, and think about this, the last one, we only know about this shark from 3 specimens in a museum. We've never seen this one in the wild. And this is the only thing we have of this thing. We have the sawfish, the large tooth sawfish. These used to be fairly common in East Africa, and certainly Zanzibar, they were very common at one time. We know this because you find all the rostrums still around there. I was 35 years ago, I saw a couple of these in fish markets in East Africa. Young Abdullah's never seen one. He'll probably never see one in his lifetime, because when they do catch them, they do once in a while show up. They're an event to see. But his kids will almost certainly never see it, let alone his grandkids. This is a wedgefish. This is one of the most endangered vertebrates in the world. I'll say it again. This is one of the most endangered vertebrates in the world. You still see these in and around Zanzibar and in East Africa, and this is one of the species that one of the species that brought me to East Africa on this particular research project, is that these things are still there. You can still see them, but they're rapidly disappearing.